Greetings, Remnant and online friends. Welcome to the Midweek Refuel, where we seek out the ancient wisdom, well, simply because modern wisdom doesn't have sneakers. Now, tonight, we're going to lace them up. We're diving into that moment in Chesterton's Orthodoxy where he says, quote, "The worship of the will is the negation of will," unquote. And the translation for that is when you make freedom itself sacred, you lose it. When you praise choice instead of truth, you end up with nothing to choose and no you left to even do the choosing. Chesterton's talking about our age. He just happened to write it a century early. So tonight, we're going to meet three characters who live right here in our modern world. They are the wisher, who dreams, but never does anything. The willer, who declares himself God and ends up very exhausted. And then the cynic, who's around every corner, who burns everything down because to them nothing means anything anymore. And then we'll meet the one sane soul left standing, the walker, the one who doesn't worship the will, he uses the will. The one with sneakers on, so to say. Because faith without feet is just a wish. And love without limits? Well, that's just a slogan. And freedom without form is just falling with better marketing and PR. And like many of you, I went to university and I had to detox after laying prostrate before the higher mind. In those years, I discovered that the higher mind was quickly losing its mind. The theology and philosophy began to require mental gymnastics that stopped revealing truth at all and instead began to celebrate confusion as though it were the thing. It's the kind of thinking that'd make a pretzel jealous. We weren't learning to seek out the truth anymore. We were learning to perform cleverness. It was an intellectual talent show where the winning act was whoever could make the simplest thing sound the most complicated. We didn't learn Greek and Hebrew so we could understand the scriptures. We learned something the professors, in their priestly robes of self-importance, called the other. And they said it so dreamily, the other. They said it like a liturgy, the other, as if uttering it might part the veil of heaven and wisdom. But when I looked behind that curtain, the other turned out to be homosexual theology, feminist theology, and social gospel, which is a lot like turkey bacon, I hear. Not quite bacon. As far as I can tell, Christianity had the cross surgically removed by universities and they replaced it with feel-good government programs. They spoke all of it as though it were enlightenment. I mean, it really was beyond the pale. But it was just old heresies with better and cleverer branding. Is that a word? It was babble with tenure, and I bought into it for a while. I thought I was expanding my mind. Turns out I was just stretching my mind past its hinges. The higher mind that I discovered, like I said, was quickly losing its mind. By the time I graduated, I had mastered the art of saying nothing in 5,000 words, all of it footnoted, of course. I can only assume university's gotten much worse. I was there when this stuff was taking hold. And when I came home from my brainwashing, my very expensive brainwashing, half lost in the fog, my mother would listen patiently as I would pontificate philosophical ramblings, and then she'd deliver her altar call in one single simple sentence. Put sneakers on it, and I'll believe it, son. Meaning, if it can't walk, if it can't live, if it can't love, and it can't act within the real world, it's not truth. It's just talk and intellectual masturbation. And that line, That line brought me home and saved me. It brought my feet back to earth and put them back into some shoes. Because everything I had been taught in those classrooms had plenty of theory, absolutely no shoes. It didn't walk, it didn't love, and it sure didn't serve. It just hovered there like a drone, making you feel sophisticated, making a lot of noise, but never landing anywhere. My mother gave me back what Chesterton calls sanity. He said, quote, "The worship of the will is the negation of the will." And that's what I had experienced. Professors worshiping the freedom to choose until they'd forgotten how to choose anything at all. I remember when Ord completely turned theology on its head. What they actually taught us went something like this. Well, because the biblical canon developed over time, and because early church councils actually made decisions, we here and now, we can make new ones because we are the next council, the next generation of enlightened interpreters. Yeah, well, that all sounded very noble, didn't it? Until you realized that what they were really saying was truth evolves whenever we do. And that's a lie. They weren't speaking the language of saints and apostles any longer. They were parroting the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, the smooth whisper that says, "You're smart enough to rewrite history, and the story is the same old serpent, this time with a syllabus." The new revelation was not holiness. The new revelation was hubris. They believed that cleverness could replace obedience, that intellect could stand in for humility. They told us that if we could just understand all the new theories, gender theory, power theory, critical theory, we would be wise enough to reshape the gospel itself. We were told that we were the enlightened generation, the ones who finally understood why all the previous generations were dead wrong. It's the oldest temptation in history, dressed up in academic language. You will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Pride and ignorance, shaking hands, each pretending to be the other's genius. That's how ideology always works. It's how it always works. Whether it calls itself progressive, political, or psychological, it flatters the student into thinking he's smarter than his father, freer than his pastor, and wiser than the apostles themselves. And if you want to see where that ends, well, just look around at the chaos of our age. It's all around us. Everyone's a prophet now. No one's a disciple. But my mother's line still cuts through that fog. Put sneakers on it, and I'll believe it. Because a truth that can't walk in the real world isn't truth. It's theory in a costume. Chesterton would say it this way. It's will without law. It's freedom without form. It is choice without a chosen good. That same old whisper that I heard in the university classroom, "You're smart enough to rewrite the truth." Yeah, it's now gone national, hasn't it? It's the same serpent, better Wi-Fi. Chesterton saw it more than a century ago. He said the modern mind would worship choice itself until it forgot what it was choosing. He saw that freedom without form would collapse into chaos, and that the moment we stopped worshiping God, we'd start worshiping something, most of the time, our own pitiful reflection. The serpent's strategy hasn't changed since Eden itself. He still offers two promises, one lie. You're enlightened, you're in control, and you'll never die. Can you figure out which is which? And from those three whispers came three personalities that run the modern world. Chesterton named them without knowing their modern titles. I called them the wisher, the willer, and the cynic. They're the apostles of the other, the prophets of progress, the priests of self. Let's meet them, shall we? First up is the wisher, our sentimental saint of self-expression. He doesn't really want the truth. He wants feelings that sound like the truth. He says, I wish everyone could just find their own truth, which is another way of saying, I hope no one ever disagrees with me. The wisher believes that sincerity redeems everything. As long as your intentions are good, reality will politely adapt itself. He builds cathedrals out of adjectives, and then he cries when the roof leaks. He loves every idea equally. Oh, he's so magnanimous, which means he's allergic to convictions, all it really means. He celebrates every voice, the other, which means he can't hear his own or the voice that whispers. His gospel is empathy without edges, compassion without commandments. And if you press him too hard, he says the same thing the serpent said. Don't you just want to understand the other? The problem with the wisher isn't that he's kind, it's that his kindness has no backbone to it. He loves without limits, which means he eventually loves what kills love itself. Chesterton would say he's the man who admires choice, but at the same time refuses to actually choose. He lives at the buffet of morality, holding a plate, never eating, terrified of offending the chef. The wisher is the theologian of maybe, the apostle of almost. He dreams of virtue, but he never walks in virtue. He quotes Jesus's compassion, but forgets Jesus's commands. He waves the flag, but never plants it anywhere. And if you look closely, you'll see him everywhere nowadays, in pulpits where doctrine is mean, in classrooms where conviction is colonial, and in churches that can no longer tell the difference between grace and permission. The wisher's creed, well, sounds nice. It ends in paralysis, because faith without feet is still just wishful thinking. And then comes the willer, the magician of the age, the self-made god in designer sneakers. He looked at the wisher and said, dreaming isn't enough. I'm going to manifest it. The willer is what happens when the serpent graduates with honors. He believes every desire is sacred, every limit oppressive, and every mirror an oracle. He doesn't pray, thy will be done. He declares, my will be divine. He says things like, I will create my own reality. Good luck with that, which sounds empowering until you realize he can't even create a balanced checkbook. His religion has one commandment, thou shalt self-actualize. His sacrament is the selfie. Whatever they do. His creed is because I said so. The willer doesn't want a father in heaven. He wants a fan base on earth. He treats creation like it's open source code and edits the parts he doesn't like. Oh, sex, sin, sacrifice, the cross. But Chesterton, he saw all this coming. He said, to admire mere choice is to refuse to choose, unquote. And that's exactly what the willer does. He chooses everything until he himself is nothing. He shouts, I'm free, while dragging a chain called ego behind him. He wants to be infinite, but can't keep a single promise. He wants to be worshipped, but can't hold a relationship together. He is the prophet of self-creation and the martyr of burnout. Because when you try to play God, you end up crucified on your own ambitions. And finally, we meet the Cynic, the last disciple of the Church of Choice. He watched the wisher dream himself to sleep, and he watched the willer exhaust himself playing God, and he concluded that, well, nothing must matter at all. He's the man who's been everywhere, believed everything, and now believes in no thing. His creed is whatever. His worship is sarcasm. His liturgy is comment sections. He's there all the time. The cynic thinks he's sophisticated because he can tear things down. He calls it deconstruction. It's a fancy word for demolishment, but it's really demolition without blueprints, isn't it? You can spot him on social media. He's there. He can quote the scripture, kinda. He knows philosophy, kinda. Or memes, barely. But only to prove that no one knows anything else either. He tweets, "Everything's corrupt," while forgetting he's tweeting from a phone built by that same corruption. Chesterton saw him a century early. He wrote, quote, "By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything." That's the Cynic's curse. He wants revolution, but he has no revelation. He wants justice, but denies judgment. He wants love, but he despises truth and ends up alone, clapping for his own cleverness in the dark. The cynic is the end game of pride. When you spend long enough calling everything foolish, well, wisdom eventually walks away and lets you prove your truth. Because there's one figure who stands when all three others have fallen. The one who doesn't worship will, he uses it. The one who doesn't theorize about truth, he walks in truth. The walker. The one sane soul left standing after the wisher, willers, and cynics have all tripped over their own brilliance. The walker doesn't worship the will, he uses the will. He doesn't stare into the mirror for meaning. He looks up and starts actually walking. His faith has feet. His love has limits. His freedom has a form. The walker is the man or woman who still believes that God's law is not a cage. God's law is a compass. He knows that a commandment is not a chain, it's a curb that keeps the road safe enough to move fast. The walker reads, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet," and actually walks by that light. He doesn't manifest, he doesn't deconstruct, he doesn't daydream. He walks, he talks, he fights, he bows, he obeys. He's the father who still leads his family in prayer, even though the culture calls him outdated. He's the mother who chooses to nurture life instead of chasing applause. He's the teenager who shuts off the phone long enough to actually open God's word. He's every single believer who still believes Jesus when Jesus says, "Follow me." The walker lives within a paradox, and Chesterton loved the freedom of the frame. He chooses one path and therefore can actually go somewhere. And you know what? As he's going, he smiles. Because while the wisher is sighing, while the willer is scheming, and while the cynic is sulking, the walker's moving. His theology doesn't hover like a drone, it lands like a good pair of shoes. The walker is what faith actually looks like when it leaves the classroom and enters daily life, gets onto the street of reality. It's discipleship with dirt on it. And that's where sanity begins again. Not in the clouds of cleverness, but on the narrow road of obedience to Christ. Because when you finally stop trying to be God, you're finally free to walk with God. And before we open the text tonight, can I ask a small favor? If this Midweek Refuel series helps you think more clearly, stand more firmly, or love Jesus more deeply, would you please take a moment of your precious time to like this video and subscribe to the channel? I do not do this for money, and I never will. I have people contacting me all the time wanting to monetize, optimize, or promote these lessons, and I thank them for their interest, but I won't use them. I'm not selling the kingdom, and I'm not renting out the pulpit. God will distribute this message to the hearts that need it most. My congregation, you who watch, you who share, and you who pray, are part of that work. Every click, every share, every word of encouragement helps the truth outrun the lies of the age. So I thank you for standing with me as we keep the message pure and the focus where it belongs, on Christ and his kingdom. Now grab your copy of G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. We're turning to chapter 3, The Suicide of Thought, beginning at the line, "The worship of will is the negation of will." So follow along or just listen. These words pulled one generation of thinkers back to sanity, and by God's grace on us, they might do it again tonight. The worship of the will is the negation of will. To admire mere choice is to refuse to choose. If Mr. Bernard Shaw comes up to me and says, "Will something," that is tantamount to saying, "I do not mind what you will." And that is tantamount to saying, "I have no will in the matter." You cannot admire will in general because the essence of will is that it is particular. A brilliant anarchist like Mr. John Davidson feels an irritation against ordinary morality, and therefore he invokes will to anything. He only wants humanity to want something. But humanity does want something. It wants ordinary morality. He rebels against the law and tells us to will something or anything. But we have willed something. We have willed the law against which he rebels. All the will worshippers, from Nietzsche to Mr. Davidson, are really quite empty of volition. They cannot will. They can hardly wish. And if anyone wants a proof of this, it can be found quite easily. It can be found in this fact, that they always talk of will as something that expands and breaks out. But it is quite the opposite. Every act of will is an act of self-limitation. To desire action is to desire limitation. In that sense, every act is an act of self-sacrifice. When you choose anything, you reject everything else. That objection, which men of this school used to make to the act of marriage, is really an objection to every act. Every act is an irrevocable selection and exclusion. Just as when you marry one woman, you give up all the others. So when you take one course of action, you give up all the other courses. If you become King of England, you give up the post of beadle in Brompton. If you go to Rome, you sacrifice a rich, suggestive life in Wimbledon. It is the existence of this negative or limiting side of will that makes most of the talk of the anarchic will worshippers little better than nonsense. For instance, Mr. John Davidson tells us to have nothing to do with "thou shalt not." But it is surely obvious that "thou shalt not" is only one of the necessary corollaries of "I will." I will go to the Lord Mayor's show, and thou shalt not stop me. Anarchism adjures us to be bold, creative artists and care for no laws or limits. But it is impossible to be an artist and not care for laws or limits. Art is limitation. The essence of every picture is the frame. If you draw a giraffe, you must draw him with a long neck. If, in your bold, creative way, you hold yourself free to draw a giraffe with a short neck, you will really find that you are not free to draw a giraffe. The moment you step into the world of facts, you step into a world of limits. You can free things from alien or accidental laws, but not from the laws of their own nature. You may, if you like, free a tiger from his bars, but do not free him from his stripes. Do not free a camel of the burden of his hump. You may be freeing him from being a camel. Do not go about as a demagogue, encouraging triangles to break out of the prison of their three sides. If a triangle breaks out of its three sides, its life comes to a lamentable end. Somebody wrote a work called The Loves of the Triangles. I never read it, but I am sure that if triangles ever were loved, they were loved for being triangular. This is certainly the case with all artistic creation, which is in some ways the most decisive example of pure will. The artist loves his limitations. They constitute the thing he is doing. The painter is glad that the canvas is flat. The sculptor is glad that the clay is colorless. In case the point is not clear, an historic example may illustrate it. The French Revolution was really an heroic and decisive thing because the Jacobins willed something definite and limited. They desired the freedoms of democracy, but also the vetoes of democracy. They wished to have votes and not to have titles. Republicanism had an ascetic side in Franklin or Robespierre, as well as an expansive side in Danton or Wilkes. Therefore, they have created something with a solid substance and shape, the square social equality and peasant wealth of France. But since then, the revolutionary or speculative mind of Europe has been weakened by shrinking from any proposal because of the limits of that proposal. Liberalism has been degraded into liberality. Men have tried to turn revolutionize from a transitive to an intransitive verb. The Jacobins could tell you not only the system he would rebel against, but what was more important, the system he would not rebel against, the system that he would trust. But the new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be really a revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything really gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind, and the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus, he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women, and then he writes another book about the sex problem in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, and then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he will cry out that war is a waste of life, and then as a philosopher that all life is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant and then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie and then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls a flag a bauble and then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away that bauble. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. And then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. It may be added that the same blank and bankruptcy can be observed in all fierce and terrible types of literature, especially in satire. Satire may be mad and anarchic, but it presupposes an admitted superiority in certain things over others. It presupposes a standard. When little boys in the street laugh at the fatness of some distinguished journalists, they are unconsciously assuming a standard of Greek sculpture. They are appealing to the marble Apollo. And the curious disappearance of satire from our literature is an instance of the fierce things fading for want of any principle to be fierce about. Nietzsche had some natural talent for sarcasm. He could sneer, though he could not laugh. But there is always something bodiless and without weight in his satire, simply because it has not any mass of common morality behind it. He is himself more preposterous than anything he denounces. But indeed, Nietzsche will stand very well as the type of the whole of this failure of abstract violence. The softening of the brain, which ultimately overtook him, was not a physical accident. If Nietzsche had not ended in imbecility, Nietzscheism would end in imbecility. Thinking in isolation and with pride ends in being an idiot. Every man who will not have softening of the heart must at last have a softening of the brain. This last attempt to evade intellectualism ends in intellectualism, and therefore in death. The sortie has failed. The wild worship of lawlessness and the materialist worship of law end in the same void. Nietzsche scales staggering mountains, but he turns up ultimately in Tibet. He sits down beside Tolstoy in the land of nothing and nirvana. They are both helpless. One because he must not grasp anything, and the other because he must not let go of anything. The Tolstoyan's will is frozen by a Buddhist instinct that all special actions are evil, but the Nietzscheite, his will is quite equally frozen by his view that all special actions are good. For if all special actions are good, none of them are special. They stand at the crossroads, and one hates all the roads, and the other likes all the roads. The result is, well, some things are not hard to calculate. They stand at the crossroads. Here I end, thank God, the first and dullest business of this book, the rough review of recent thought. After this, I begin to sketch a view of life which may not interest my reader, but which, at any rate, interests me. In front of me, as I close this page, is a pile of modern books that I have been turning over for the purpose, a pile of ingenuity, a pile of futility. By the accident of my present detachment, I can see the inevitable smash of the philosophies of Schopenhauer and Tolstoy, Nietzsche and Shaw, as clearly as an inevitable railway smash could be seen from a balloon. They are all on the road to the emptiness of the asylum. For madness may be defined as using mental activity so as to reach mental helplessness, and they've nearly reached it. He who thinks he is made of glass thinks to the destruction of thought, for glass cannot think. So he who wills to reject nothing wills the destruction of will, for will is not only the choice of something, but the rejection of almost everything. And as I turn and tumble over the clever, wonderful, tiresome, and useless modern books, the title of one of them rivets my eye. It is called Jeanne d'Arc by Anatole France. I have only glanced at it, but a glance was enough to remind me of Renan's Vie de Jésus. It has the same strange method of the reverent skeptic. It discredits supernatural stories that have some foundation simply by telling natural stories that have no foundation. Because we cannot believe in what a saint did, we are told to pretend that we know exactly what he felt. But I do not mention either book in order to criticize it, but because the accidental combination of the names called up two startling images of sanity which blasted all the books before me. Joan of Arc was not stuck at the crossroads, either by rejecting all the paths like Tolstoy or by accepting them all like Nietzsche. She chose a path and went down it like a thunderbolt. Yet Joan, when I come to think of her, had in her all that was true either in Tolstoy or Nietzsche, all that was even tolerable in either of them. I thought of all that is noble in Tolstoy, the pleasure in plain things, especially in plain pity, the actualities of the earth, the reverence for the poor, the dignity of the bowed back. Joan of Arc had all that, and with this great addition, that she endured poverty as well as admiring it, whereas Tolstoy is only a typical aristocrat trying to find out its secret. And then I thought of all that was brave and proud and pathetic in poor Nietzsche and his mutiny against the emptiness and timidity of our time. I thought of his cry for the ecstatic equilibrium of danger, his hunger for the rush of great horses, his cry to arms. Well, Joan of Arc had all of that. And again, with this difference, that she did not praise fighting, but fought. We know that she was not afraid of an army, while Nietzsche, for all we know, was afraid of a cow. Tolstoy only praised the peasant. She was the peasant. Nietzsche only praised the warrior. She was the warrior. She beat them both at their own antagonistic ideals. She was more gentle than the one, more violent than the other. Yet she was a perfectly practical person who did something, while they are wild speculators who do nothing. It was impossible that the thought should not cross my mind that she and her faith had perhaps some secret of moral unity and utility that had been lost. And with that thought came a larger one, and the colossal figure of her master had also crossed the theater of my thoughts. The same modern difficulty which darkened the subject matter of Anatole France also darkened that of Ernest Renan. Renan also divided his hero's pity from his hero's pugnacity. Renan even represented the righteous anger at Jerusalem as a mere nervous breakdown after the idyllic expectations of Galilei. As if there were any inconsistency between having a love for humanity and having a hatred for inhumanity. Altruists, with thin, weak voices, denounce Christ as an egoist. Egoist, with even thinner and weaker voices, denounce him as an altruist. In our present atmosphere, such cavils are comprehensible enough. The love of a hero is more terrible than the hatred of a tyrant. The hatred of a hero is more generous than the love of a philanthropist. There is a huge and heroic sanity of which moderns can only collect the fragments. There is a giant of whom we see only the lopped arms and legs walking about. They have torn the soul of Christ into silly strips labeled egoism and altruism, and they are equally puzzled by his insane magnificence and his insane meekness. They have parted his garments among them, and for his vesture they have cast lots, though the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. When I read this chapter of Orthodoxy, I can't help thinking of the German artist Albrecht Dürer and his haunting engraving Melancholia I. It is absolutely one of my favorite pieces of art. For me, her gaze, the angel's gaze, reaches beyond the frame of her reality. You've probably seen it, the brooding angel seated among the tools of genius, a compass, a sphere, a magic square, an unfinished building. Everything she needs to create is right there, and yet she sits paralyzed, chin in hand, her wings heavy with the weight of thought. That angel is what Chesterton was describing today. She is the world after it has worshipped will and lost the will to use it. She has knowledge without wonder. She has reason without revelation. She has potential without purpose. She is humanity staring at its own brilliance and realizing it can't make anything fly. Chesterton called that state the suicide of thought. Dürer called it melancholy. It is the picture of the wisher who never acts, the willer who exhausts himself trying to be divine, and the cynic who despairs that anything divine exists at all. But notice one more detail in that engraving. Behind the angel, on the horizon, there is a ray of light, a comet, or a rising star breaking through the clouds. It's faint, but it's there. That, my friends, is the hope of the walker. The moment that light touches the tools on the ground, they stop being symbols of frustration and become again instruments. That the same happens in us. When the light of Christ breaks through the paralysis of pride, when we stop worshiping choice and start actually walking in obedience to Christ, the compass draws true circles again. The hammer builds instead of broods, and the mind becomes a servant of the Most High Spirit. Durer captured what Chesterton wrote: intellect waiting for redemption, and redemption came, not through another philosophy, but through a person who simply said, "Follow me. Walk." So tonight, don't sit brooding among your tools. Don't let your mind become the angel of melancholy. Lace up your shoes. Walk. Let the light of Christ turn your thoughts into footsteps. Put your sneakers on. Life awaits. Christ is King. Hail to that King.